Richard C. Cook is our guest for the next hour. He's an economic historian. He has written for some of the largest publications in the country. He has consulted for NASA, and we are really honored to have him on with us today. He also writes for a lot of big publications like Global Research, and I wanted to get him on because we'd have him on 2-3 years ago, and he predicted a lot of what is now unfolding. He understands from the establishment's own documents, their own admissions, that they are engineering a world economic implosion. Over a year ago on this show, he concurred with my analysis and added to it that they were going to implode the economy, then announce a new bank of the world with carbon taxes paid to them. So use the crisis they created to bring in even more control. I want him to flesh out the basic background of this and then get into what's currently happening with his prognosis of how serious things are currently and how bad they are going to get. And people say, well, we know how bad they are right now. No, you don't. I know a lot of us, it's hard to gauge different sectors of the economy in the U.S., worldwide, how fast this is going downhill. It's a recession when your neighbor is out of work. It's a depression when you're out of work. I believe we're really officially in a depression right now. And even the Economist magazine, with their economists, have come out and said that. So Richard C. Cook, great to have you here with us.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
You bet. You've got the floor. Break down what we're facing right now, what's really happening.
Well, it's collapsing, and the bottom is not in sight. I was at a conference over the weekend in New York. It was the annual conference of the Eastern Economic Association, and one of the big-name economist, Paul Krugman, who's the incoming president of the Eastern Economic Association, spoke. He said it's a Great Depression scale right now. There was another speaker there. You may have heard of him. His name is Henry Liu. He's the publisher of Asia Times, and he looks at it from the perspective of China and the Asian economies. He came up with an interesting statistic. 2 years ago, the total valuation of all of the assets in the world was approximately $60 trillion. Today, 2 years later, it's approximately $30 trillion. So half the value of the entire world economy has disappeared in 2 years, and it's still going down. The bottom has not yet been seen. Now, to me, one of the most interesting facts about this is that if you really think about it, the ability of the producing economy of the world to produce goods and services has not changed. It has not decreased. In fact, the ability of the world economy to produce constantly increases because of technology, because of the growth of knowledge, because of the growth of efficiency, and as we've seen in the U.S. from the productivity data, the growth of productivity of the economy. Even though people's wages are stagnant, even though people's portfolios are collapsing, the stock market is collapsing, the derivative market is collapsing, every market is collapsing, and yet the producing economy continues to grow. So why is there this contradiction? That's what nobody has figured out, and that's where we really have to focus.
Well, we know, and we'll come back and talk about this, the parasitic banking economy has now become about 30% of the real economy. They've created Ponzi schemes. Many economists say over 1,000 trillion or 1 quadrillion. They've created this tsunami of fiat currency and credit. And so they want to implode the world economy so they can consolidate it all. This is a financial coup d'etat against the planet. We'll get Richard C. Cook's take on that on the other side of this quick break for the rest of the hour. And later in the hour, I'm going to open the phones up, but specifically on the economy, specifically how it's affecting you, or questions for Richard C. Cook at 1-800-259-9231. If it isn't on that, I'm going to hang up on you. Okay, Richard C. Cook, some stations don't carry that first 5 minutes when you're on with us. So briefly recap what you were saying, and then go into what's really developing, what's really happening right now with this depression level thing that is taking place worldwide.
Well, let me plug my website first, www.richardccook.com. I've got a couple new articles up there just this past week. One I call The Last Picture Show, which is the name I use for the new Obama administration budget. But basically what we have seen is a complete collapse in the value, the nominal value, the paper value, if you will, of all world assets. I mentioned that I was at a conference of the Eastern Economic Association over the weekend, and the figure was put out there that 2 years ago, the total valuation of all of the assets in the world, this is everything of tangible value, the price on it at that time was $60 trillion approximately. Today, the total is under $30 trillion and falling, and the bottom has not been seen yet. So what we're seeing is not the disappearance of things of value. We're not seeing the disappearance of the ability of the producing economy to produce goods and services. What we're seeing is a collapse of the price system. We're seeing a deflation of a bubble, a series of bubbles that has been constructed by the world banking system really over the last, it goes back 30, 40 years in its entire history, even further if you want to look at the start of the Federal Reserve System. But it's been in the last 10 years when the bubbles have really just gotten totally out of control, and it's been the banking system with the Federal Reserve every step of the way enabling this to create this enormous bubble that's now collapsed. So again, it's not the ability of the world economy to produce what we need to live. It's the financial aspects of it, the bubble aspects of it that we're seeing collapse, and it's still on its way down. And as you say, we've got talk about the world financial organizations, the big ones, particularly the ones in Europe, ready to step in now and put together a world financial order that is going to take control of all the economies of the world through the international banking system. So all of that is going on right now.
Let me just read your bio to folks. I forgot to do that earlier. Richard C. Cook is a former U.S. federal government analyst whose career included service with the U.S. Civil Service Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the Carter White House, and NASA, and the U.S. Treasury Department. His articles on economics, politics, and space policy have appeared on numerous websites. His book, The Monetary Reform, entitled We Hold These Truths, The Promise of Monetary Reform, is in preparation. He is the author of Challenger Revealed, an insider account of how the Reagan administration caused the greatest tragedy of the space age. Called by one writer the most important space flight book of the last 20 years. His website is richardccook.com. Richard, specifically, though, if you have private banks engineering the collapse so they can consolidate things, and from past interviews I know you agree with that, we need to then expose the fact that they are not just criminals creating Ponzi schemes through governments and private means, but that they need to be arrested, not now pose as the world's saviors. And we've seen them with the banker bailout of October 3rd, saying we're going to have a depression if you don't do this, then withholding the money for the subprime mortgages and saying we won't say where it was spent. Bloomberg reporting $9.7 trillion taken. As you just said, that's a third of all the world's real assets. I mean, quantify this, because, you know, they keep expecting good news from Obama or for Geithner to say what they're going to do, but they never tell anybody what they're going to do. They only badmouth and talk about nationalization of the banks to drive them down even further, to further destroy confidence. Is this not premeditated economic terrorism to create a global fire sale where they're the only ones with liquidity left to buy it up?
Well, that's how the banking system traditionally has worked. If you go back in history and you see the history of the panics that occurred leading up to the Federal Reserve System, that's what the banks did. They would call in their loans, it would collapse the currency, collapse the economy, and then they would step in to buy assets for pennies on the dollar. Exactly the same thing happened with the Great Depression. The Great Depression was an engineered event. It was not something that just happened. The banks built the bubbles of the 1920s, and then when the bubbles were fully ripe, they stepped in and they pulled back on the margin lending requirements and collapsed the economy at that time, and then they stepped in and made huge fortunes by buying everything they could in the 1930s. We're now seeing the same thing. And in fact, when I started writing about this 2 years ago, the first article in the series I wrote came out in June of 2007, and it was the title was "It's Official: The Collapse of the U.S. Economy Has Begun." Because I saw at that time what they were saying about the extraordinary debt levels compared to equity in businesses was a disaster waiting to happen, and then you had the Federal Reserve deliberately ratcheting down the interest rates that it had raised only 2 years previously to create the housing bubble. Now they stepped in and they destroyed the housing bubble by their interest rate policies. And I quoted at that time the CEO of Carlyle, the equity firm that the Bush family is so closely involved with. And what he was saying was he was sending out a notice to all of his branches. And he was saying, keep your eyes open, because what we're going to have after this thing collapses is the buying opportunity of a generation. Because everything is going to be dirt cheap